All right. Hi, everyone. So, for those who just joined, welcome to the first webinar for this academic year of the webinar series on researching the far right methods and ethic. So, my name is Audrey Gagnon, and I am an assistant professor at the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa in Canada. I am also affiliated with the Center for Research on Extremism, known as CREX, based at the University of Oslo, and I am a member of the Executive Committee of CANSES, so the Canadian Network for Research on Security, Extremism and Society. So this webinar series is now co-organized by CANSES and CREX. So for those who are less familiar with this webinar series, it started in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, and it aims to facilitate a discussion on the ethical, methodological, political, personal, practical, and professional challenges involved in researching violent extremism and terrorism. So these webinars are offered on the third Thursday of every month. So today's webinar will be featuring Sarah Thompson, and we'll discuss the challenges and benefits associated with being a female researcher in a male-dominated space, issues related to security clearance, issues related to gaining access to practitioners and data, and also ethical consideration related to working with vulnerable populations and data sharing. So let me first present today's panelists. So Sarah Thompson, so she's a professor of criminology at Toronto Metropolitan University. She is currently appointed to the National Hate Crime Task Force. She's also a co-chair and international group of subject matter expert on hate for the Eradicate Hate Global Summit. And she sits on the CACP Counter-Terrorism and National Security, so Countering Violent Extremism Committee. So Sarah will present for about 30 or 40 minutes, and this will be followed by a Q&A session. So if you have any question, please feel free to write them down using the Q&A button. Do not use the chat function because it will be easier for me to moderate the question at the end of the webinar that way. So that's it. I think I spoke enough, and I can now let Sarah do her presentation. Oh, you're on mute, Sarah.
One would think after all this time I'd have figured that out. I'm just going to share my screen and try to pull up. Oh goodness, where is my slide deck? Hang on one second. Can you see that?
Not yet.
That's not good. One moment. Sorry. Share. How about now?
Yes, now it's working.
Excellent. Okay. So thank you, Audrey, for the warm welcome, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I know folks are from all over the place, and so wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So in my comments this afternoon, this evening, this morning, depending on where you're at, I want to cover off 6 general areas of discussion. I'm going to start just by giving a quick overview about how I got here, how I found myself 15 years into my academic career doing research in the national security space. Spoiler alert, that was never my plan. And you know that old joke, if you want to make God, Allah, the universe, whatever spirituality or religion you subscribe to, if you want to make God laugh, tell her your plans. And that certainly is sort of how my career and my programs of research have played out. They often were just sort of serendipitous. I was at the right time, the right place. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Then we'll pivot and we'll talk a little bit about sort of what I've learned over the last 10 or so years that I've been doing work in the national security space about, as a researcher, gaining access to working with communities, but also gaining access to and working with national security practitioners and their institutions, and also sort of other data sources that have import for a variety of national security issues. So we'll talk about that. A couple of words on security clearance. I don't know more than I do know about the security clearance process, though I have recently gone through it. So I can tell you about my experience, but I can't speak to much more than that. And I also should just underscore that everything I say is about my experience in the Canadian context. And my experience in the Canadian context may or may not be more broadly generalizable to other researchers or other national contexts. Then we'll pivot to the fourth area of discussion. Just want to sort of underscore the critical importance when you're doing this work of researcher positionality, recognizing and acknowledging your own positionality. Also would like to talk to you about some methodological, ethical, and data sharing considerations that I am alive to because of a lot of the work that I've done alongside vulnerable and otherwise marginalized populations. So just a few of the lessons learned from working with those populations. And then I want to close just by speaking to some of the challenges and benefits that I have sort of observed by virtue of being a female and an outsider, certainly an outsider to the community-based organizations, the communities, and the national security actors and their organizations that I typically work alongside in my more recent programs of research. And then a couple of final thoughts, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A that I understand Audrey will be moderating. My goodness, I haven't had enough coffee today. So that's the plan. Let's get moving. So how did I get here? Just to give you sort of a sense of just the winding road that I walked down from when I finished my PhD in 2009 until today. I've done work in a variety of different areas. I am a trained criminologist through and through. All of my degrees are in criminology from the University of Toronto. And my work, my thesis research, and my work for the first 5 or so years of my career was squarely in the urban violence category. And so the first four bullets on this particular slide sort of lay out some of the larger pieces of research I did in that period. My thesis research looked at the social and spatial distribution of homicide in Toronto over a 20-year period. Then I did some work with Anna Pratt at York University on her SSHRC-funded research on racial profiling at the border, at land and air border crossings here in Canada. And then with Sandra Basirius, who is now with the University of Alberta, I did some work on gun and gang violence in Regent Park and other social housing communities in Toronto. That research opened our eyes to the fact that the ongoing revitalization of Regent Park in Canada, our social or public housing communities are in a pretty sorry state due to decades of ineffective investment. And so many of our social housing communities are undergoing a process of revitalization that is causing quite a bit of harm to original residents. Happy to talk about that or forward publications, but don't want to get into it now. But that led us to the fourth research, which was really looking at the impact of massive neighborhood change, particularly in social housing communities. When those communities are being gentrified or revitalized, what our research and other research has found is that is very destabilizing and can actually lead to increases in levels of crime and violence for quite some time while the community is undergoing those changes. Then, after those sort of first four projects, my work pivoted decidedly toward the national security space. Sandra and I were invited to put in a proposal to a Public Safety Canada funding competition to do some research with Tamil and Somali youth about their views of groups that are stereotypically and typically associated with their diasporas. So we interviewed a lot of young Tamils in the Greater Toronto area about their views on the LTTE, and young Somali Canadians in Toronto, Edmonton, and in Surrey, British Columbia about their views on Al-Shabaab and ISIS. And the findings of those projects showed that there were very, very aggressive counter narratives that were very natural within these communities that basically eschewed these groups and the violence that they support in support of the cause, as they say. Then I conducted some formative evaluations of two CVE programs in Canada, one here in Toronto and one in Calgary. For those of you who may not be familiar, CVE is sort of extremism, terrorism prevention programming, identifying individuals who may be radicalizing to violence, providing them with a series of wraparound supports to hopefully reduce the likelihood that they will ultimately go out and perpetrate violence. Then more recently, I've done some research with Michelle Grossman and Paul Thomas, looking at intimate bystander community reporting thresholds and preferences. If you love someone and you see that they're radicalizing to violence and you become aware that they are mobilizing, that they're getting ready to plan an attack, What do people want and what would people want and need in order to pick up the phone and get help for that individual and hopefully sort of prevent the extremist attack that they are planning. And so we did that project. And then I pivoted a little bit and did some work on police body cams with a colleague at work. And then more recently got 2 years into a 3-year program of research with the scholars who are listed in that last bullet there. To expand the community reporting research that is in that third last bullet. Each of us had done that research in our respective countries, in Canada, the US, Australia, and the UK. And so we came together. We were invited by DHS a couple of years ago to come together, put a proposal together, sort of to take our respective research projects to the next step. We got 2 years into that 3-year program of research, and the Trump administration decided earlier this year that it was a little too woke for their liking, and they killed the project and took all the funding. And so that research project, that last one on the list, is incomplete. We got 2 years of work done, and I understand that we are suing DHS in the hope that we might recover that money, but I not holding out much hope in that regard. So that's kind of how I got here. And so as you can see, it was just sort of moving through a series of projects, following the things that were of interest to me, keeping my eyes wide open to opportunities as they were presented to me. And, you know, it's only sort of when you look back and see how everything happened that you realize, oh, okay, this is how I got to where I'm at. Was never my plan. And that's kind of how life works sometimes. Though I appreciate that many of you likely know that you want to work in this area and have a very clear idea about the kind of work that you want to do. And so I hope that some of my comments today, at least, are helpful to all of you, regardless of where you may be at in terms of thinking about the future. Let's talk a little bit about access. Let's where the rubber hits the road, as they say. And I want to make my comments about access related to accessing communities and community-based organizations in the research process, but also access in terms of accessing national security actors and or the agencies that they work for. In both contexts, the community side and on the practitioner side, relationships and vouching are of critical importance. Having somebody on the inside of either the community or of a community organization, or having somebody on the inside of, you know, INSET or the RCMP, and having that person vouch for you. I know this researcher, I've read their work, they've been around, they have a lot of legitimacy in the space, yada, yada, yada. That kind of vouching, in my experience, has been enormously, enormously helpful to gaining access both to communities and to security agencies and their people. And so my advice to you would be, if you haven't already, start building, start actively strategizing and thinking through how you're going to build your own networks and how you're going to work to cultivate relationships, you know, with actors in a variety of different spaces. So what I did early on when I was a PhD candidate, I had business cards printed with the university's logo, the department's name, my email and contact information. And every conference I went to, every work-related function I went to, I was handing out my cards left, right, and center. I was getting people's cards. I was writing on the back of cards, you know, little cheats to myself. Like this was the guy that I spoke to about X, and he mentioned that he has, you know, this, you know, I write little cheat notes. And then within 6 to 7 days of attending a conference or whatever, I would take all of the business cards that I gathered and I would send follow-up emails, just quick ones. Hello, lovely to meet you. Just wanted to make sure that you had my contact information. If there's, you know, ever anything that you'd like to discuss, you know, I'm all ears. Just a friendly follow-up. Don't expect them to respond. Typically they won't, especially if you're somewhat new to the space. But I printed cards, I handed them out left, right, and center. I kept cards. I built my own sort of repositories of individuals and I organized them. I have my community repositories, my practitioner repositories. Sounds like a lot of work. It is a lot of work, but it pays off, especially as the weeks and months grow into years and your repositories get bigger and bigger and bigger because you know more people, you become embedded in more networks, and perhaps equally importantly, more people know who you are. I also would go to lots of conferences. I would go to lunch and learns. I would go to community events, a lot of community events, community marches, and I would just make sure that I was seen. I would get out there. I'd hand out my cards. I'd get as many cards as I could. And I kept showing up, especially on the community side, but not just, but especially. And so just want to impress upon you that there's quite a bit of work to be done in order to get access. And that vouching piece is critically important, but so too is ongoing relationship management over the longer term. Once you've established a nice rapport with someone, maintaining and cultivating that relationship over time is also really, really important to securing and maintaining pathways to success. And so what I've learned, just to give you some I don't know, some hacks, things that have worked for me over the years, being really, really straight up, straight talk with both communities and with folks that work for security agencies. Really, really important. I don't mince words. I don't waste anybody's time. I make it very, very clear that anybody who wishes to participate will do so completely anonymously. Their confidentiality will be protected. Um, with police organizations, or other national security organizations, particularly at the early end of the relationship, I have a spiel that I go through about the data show what the data show. And so if we're going to work together on this, you need to understand that the data show what the data show. And you can't, and I have a whole thing, and I'm happy to talk offline about what I say and do. But I make it very, very clear to them that if you're going to do this, then you've got to be prepared to work with whatever we find. And I say to them, I'm not interested in bashing. I'm interested in working constructively to identify and address and mitigate issues and harms that your processes and protocols may be causing. And so it's really, really important that we understand that this is an exercise designed to improve what you're doing and the service that you're able to provide. And what that means is that the data show what the data show, whether you like it or not. And I will not be changing anything, and I will walk away from this project should it ever come to pass that I feel pressured to change, remove, add stuff that is not appropriate to change, remove, or add. And to date, I have walked away on one project for those reasons. I've said, we had this conversation. Obviously, you feel differently. Would have been nice to have known this months ago. Thank you for your time. I'm out. And that was the end of that. So you also need to do your boundary work carefully and mean it when you say it. So straight talk matters. I found on the community side of things, you may have noticed that I'm like the whitest white girl of all time. So recognizing, articulating my positionality, especially with community audiences, acknowledging my privilege, is also critically important to, communities in particular, recognizing, okay, she's an outsider to the community. She's a privileged person by virtue of her race, her education, her socioeconomic status, et cetera, but she recognizes her positionality. She owned it. And I found that recognizing my positionality and owning it very, very, very early in the relationship, particularly with community, has been quite beneficial because it's somewhat of the big white elephant in the room, pardon the pun. And so owning that and being the one to raise it, I have found has been beneficial to allaying concerns on the part of community members. Not always, but much of the time. It's also important that you underscore for potential community or security partners what's in it for them. What I've learned is that the benefits of research are unknown to most people who aren't researchers. And so sometimes you have to underscore and make clear what those potential benefits might be in order to hopefully get folks to agree to work alongside you. And so that's what I do. I take the time to make sure that I show whoever it is that I'm trying to bring alongside me in the research how and why what I'm proposing to do is relevant to their work, their lives, or both. And so, for example, when I am approaching community members or representatives from community organizations about participating, I always point out that the research could be used for advocacy. It could be used to sort of highlight the work that the agency is doing. The community members could take the research and use it to advocate on behalf of, needed community change, resources and services for the community. And so in that way, the research can be made directly actionable to the community to help them, sort of leverage the best and most recent available evidence to meet their needs. And then for practitioners, I often sort of say, there are many benefits to research, including they can help all of you shift what you're doing more toward meaningful evidence-based practice. You can also justify and defend any operational decisions that you make by saying what we leaned on the existing evidence base, the most recent and best available information, and we generated information by bringing researchers on board, and that can be said to demonstrate that the organization really cares about the research and really cares about evidence-based practice. And so I found that those sorts of considerations can often help to bring practitioners on side and become more willing to participate in the research process. Not always, but there's much more openness I've seen, particularly in the last 5 or so years, on the part of national security actors to partnering in meaningful ways with academics. And I'm excited by that, by the fact that I'm seeing a lot more by way of meaningful collaboration between academics and practitioners. And I do hope for all of you that that continues to be the case so that you can get the access that you need to do the work that you wish to do. And then finally, I just want to underscore what always happens, and that is there's always an access tax. So in the work that you do to build relationships and networks with community members, community organizations, security actors, and the organizations with which they work, you're going to be trying to sort of convince them how and why partnering up with you is a benefit to them. And you establish a nice rapport. And what I've learned over the years is that there's a tax that's associated with becoming involved in these networks. My phone rings at least 3 times a day or I get at least 3 texts or messages a day from people working in the national security space wanting me to find research for them. Hey, do you know anything about X? Is there any way you could pull a few papers and just draft like a real quick and dirty 1-page overview? And I always say yes, because that's that ongoing relationship management cultivation. If I can make myself and my work and my skills useful to them, that's not a bad thing, right? Because they remember that. And so when they reach out saying, hey, Sarah, sorry to bug, but I'm wondering if by this time tomorrow you could review this massive literature and put together a 1-pager in plain English, I typically will be like, can't do it by tomorrow, but I can get it to you by Friday, and I'll do it, because I've learned that they remember that. And if you scratch their backs, they will scratch yours as well, more often than not. So just be prepared that when you cultivate these relationships and become embedded in these professional and community networks, you're not going to just be sitting there and, waiting to get your access, that you are going to be working because they're going to be reaching out. The community as well. Last year, I counted 37 invited talks to community organizations on everything from cyber hate to how do we protect young Muslim girls from online hate. And so I regularly will also show up and agree to do talks for community organizations. Again, that you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It just helps to enhance the relationship, enhance the trust, and develop much more of a community of practice in your local area that I would argue is of benefit to everybody. If people that are doing work in the same space know about each other and the work that they're doing, that's a good thing, especially in a larger space where demand for these sorts of programs and services often exceeds supply, right? So we kind of got to partner up and help each other out. So that's what I wanted to say about access. Can't say much about security clearance because, as I said a little while ago, I've only recently gone through the process. What I can tell you is that in my experience, if you want to do community-based research on national security issues, going into communities and understanding their experiences, their perspectives, their views, typically security clearance is not required. Ethical clearance is, but security clearance is typically not required. But if you want to do research that requires access to classified information, files, assets, or work sites, excuse me, typically security clearance is required. And the security clearance system varies by country, though there are obvious sort of similarities. I can't speak to the different levels or types in the Canadian context, and I don't think that's really the purpose of our work here today. But what I can tell you is that as an individual researcher, I could not initiate my own security screening in order to be able to have security clearance, in the hope that Should I get a grant? I could go to an agency and say, yo, I've got clearance, let me in, I've got this grant money. Not how it works. You can't initiate your own security screenings. In order to get a security screening, you have to already be an employee of an organization that requires access to protected or classified information or assets or work sites as part of the work that you're doing for them. So you can be a regular full-term employee, you can be on contract, on subcontract, or on lease, but you must be working an employee of an organization that requires access to protected materials in order to be allowed, I guess, I don't have the language, to gain security clearance. And so my recent experience, I was on contract with a federal government agency. I actually still am on an as-needed basis that required that I get security clearance. So they initiated that process on my behalf. I submitted all of the information that was required, and it was a lot of information, did a couple of interviews and whatnot, and ultimately got my security clearance. So again, if you're doing community-based work, security clearance typically is not required, but for agency work that would require you to gain access to classified and other sort of protected information, you need security clearance, and you need to be working for an agency that requires you to do that work in order to get clearance in Canada. Let's talk about ethics. This is a slide I just added, so I'm just going to go over it quickly because I don't want to go over time. So I did a lot of research that wasn't in the national security space before I pivoted and started doing research in this space. I never had any problems with the ethics process at my university. We call it the REB, the Research Ethics Bureau? Yeah, whatever. I never had any issues gaining ethics approval until I started doing work in the national security space. And so I also just want to point out that what I'm about to say is specific to my university and may or may not hold at yours, should you be working for a university. But as soon as I started working in the national security space, I experienced very, very significant resistance and pushback from my university's REB when it came to getting ethics approval for most of my programs of research that involved police and other security actors. So it wasn't about working in the national security space so much as it was, I feel, in my view, pushback to working with police and other security actors. And so just by way of an example, one project in the NS that required or was in the NS space took almost 11 months of back and forth with the REB at my university. There were some weeks where they wanted 2 and 3 meetings a week with me to ask me questions at a granular level that I have never, ever experienced before. And in talking with colleagues, none of them have ever even heard of researchers being put through what I have been put through and others have been put through to do this kind of work. More recently, I got some money that for sort of a quick and dirty, it was surprise money for a quick and dirty research project that had to be done within like 2 or 3 months. And the ethics application for this research, which would have involved 8 interviews and then analyzing, the results of those interviews, the ethics approval to do that took so long that the agency ended up taking back about 1/3 of the funding because the funding period had expired. And that project currently sits incomplete because my university couldn't or wouldn't give me ethics clearance in time to be able to do that research according to the time frame that the money was available for. So frustrating, to say the least. Hopefully none of you will go through this. But my view is, my perspective, and from what I understand, there were some folks who sit on the REB at my institution who have personal views about research with system actors that shape how they do what they do, letting personal biases step in and affect their professional decision-making. And it's not just me. There are a number of researchers at my university who are complaining about these very issues. Hopefully they won't happen to you, but be prepared and have a plan B in the event that they do. Few comments about, I'm just looking at the time. Okay, I'm good. Working with vulnerable and marginalized populations. So much of my research has been community-based research in the national security space. I mentioned some of my work with Sandra Basirius, where we interviewed hundreds of young people from both the Tamil and the Somali diasporas in Canada about their views of a variety of things, including the LTTE, Al-Shabaab, and ISIS. And there are, through that work and other work that I've done with the community, I've learned some important lessons that I would like to reiterate here today. So most of you hopefully are alive to the fact that there have been in various literatures, various interdisciplinary literatures, very important concerns raised about the reproduction of gender, racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, and other inequalities and power differentials within the research process, and therefore, by extension, within sort of the production of scientific knowledge. Indeed, academic researchers, like all of us, hold power, privilege, and status within our respective institutions. But we also hold quite a bit of power, privilege, and status insofar as it relates to the production of scientific knowledge itself, right? We also, researchers do, we may also have power and privilege that stems from our respective gender, class, racial and ethnic backgrounds, or other identity positions, or an intersection of more than one particular identity characteristic. And so both of these positionalities, right, our power and our privilege, or our relative power and privilege, have the potential to reproduce systemic inequalities and power differentials within the research process and within the sort of production of scientific knowledge that can and do harm otherwise vulnerable and marginalized communities. Now, the good news is that the maturing of the field has prompted an enhanced understanding of the need to establish what many refer to as research equity among academics and community partners, ensuring that the research process is equitable in any and all ways for both researchers and any community partners that are involved in the research. But despite these developments in recent years, and as Muhammad et al. 2014 remind us, quote, power structures remain the hegemonic social context. And so what that means and what that necessitates is that mechanisms of power and privilege be both recognized and understood by researchers, and then steps be taken to sort of mitigate the likelihood that power and privilege could ultimately go into effect the research that you do and or cause harm to the populations that you're doing research with and about. Right. Okay. A few more words on working with vulnerable populations. So what do you do then? So you need to be alive to your positionality. You need to be alive to the possibility that your work could cause harm to marginalized and otherwise vulnerable populations. So what do? Well, fortunately, there are research methodologies and traditions that center these sorts of considerations. And so I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking about how research methods really matter when it comes to working with vulnerable and otherwise marginalized populations. Sorry, my brain is not working today. And how I have endeavored to achieve the aforementioned research equity when conducting community-based research. So the program of research, or the research tradition, I guess, is the most appropriate way of framing this, that I am familiar with, and it's really an umbrella term under which fall a whole variety of different approaches. But the umbrella term is community-based participatory action approaches, CBPA approaches. And most of my community-based research has leveraged various aspects of CBPA approaches to work alongside communities in the national security space. And so the CBPA methodology, alongside other similar methodologies, can help us to reduce or mitigate the potential for harm that may stem from things like researcher positionality, power, and privilege. And so in the community-based research that I've been involved with, as I've said, I and my colleagues have invoked CBPA methods to work alongside communities to define a scope of research activities that reflects their concerns and their local context. And so, in a nutshell, the intent of CBPA approaches is to effectively transform the research process from a relationship where researchers are acting upon a community, researching and studying a community, that's the old way, to instead conducting research where researchers are working alongside community members in meaningful partnerships that are characterized by research equity. And so, though power sharing is stated as an explicit goal of CBPA approaches, not all researchers are self-reflective in their positionality, which can lead to their failure to recognize, acknowledge, and or address unequal power relations that may adversely affect the research process and outputs. And so again, I quote Muhammad et al. Of 2014, who reiterate and remind us that awareness and reflexivity of one's identity or identities as one of the more salient constructs of positionality can offer guidance to all of us in this regard and help us to recognize, acknowledge, and address unequal power relations where they may exist in our programs of research. A couple quick comments on key benefits. I'm going to finish on time, Audrey, no matter what. A couple quick comments on key benefits of the community-based participatory action approach. In my work, I've learned that the CBPA approach or approaches are particularly useful in research involving vulnerable or marginalized populations because these methods provide the opportunity to meaningfully co-develop, to work together, to identify and co-develop research goals and research questions, as well as identifying and deploying the most appropriate and culturally sensitive data collection instruments, methodologies, and dissemination strategies. I've personally learned on multiple occasions that community partners are also integral to providing assistance in terms of data analysis, but equally importantly, data interpretation. I can't tell you how many times I'd sort of look at a finding and I'd say, okay, I think this is what's going on here. And our community partners, my community partners would be like, yo, I don't think so. Here's what's really happening. And they would lay it out. And without their lived experience and deep knowledge of the context and the issues, I may very well, in all my white privilege, have completely misunderstood, misinterpreted, and then sort of misrepresent my research findings in ways that could actually come back and cause harm to the community. So having, equal partnerships with community members over the entirety of the research process is so critically important, and for so many reasons. Sandra and I did a lot of work using these methodologies or this methodology for the research with community partners in the Somali and Tamil diasporas. Happy to chat about that during the Q&A, should anybody have questions or want more concrete examples of sort of how these methods were appropriate. But I move on. Still on methods, but we're almost done talking about CBPA methods. So just to sort of, just the take-home message on these methods, the use of adherence to the CBPA framework can help to ensure that your research design, your research objectives, and your research outputs are community-based. In other words, that they're grounded in the needs, the issues, the concerns, and the preferred approaches of communities and the community-based organizations that serve them. Adherence to the CBPA framework also helps to ensure that your research is truly participatory, that it meaningfully engages community members as research partners, or in a way that achieves so-called research equity, and engages them as full partners and at all stages of the research process. This cannot be a performative exercise where you just meet with a group of community stakeholders at the beginning and then maybe report back to them at the end. Community-based participatory action methods are all about building meaningful, trusting relationships and working together from beginning to end. That's what this is all about. And finally, adherence to the CBPA framework can also help to ensure that your research and your research outputs are both action-based and action-oriented. In other words, ensuring that what you ultimately produce is supportive of and or enhances strategic action on the part of agencies, on the part of communities, on the part of community organizations. In other words, in ways that help to move the needle in a meaningful way on the issues that are being examined. Last thing on CBPA methods I'll say is just this. It's really important that I stress, and I already have, so you're likely already alive to this, that designing and operationalizing a CBPA framework for your research is a very labor and time intensive exercise. It involves an enormous amount of outreach, engagement, and ongoing relationship building at the community level, along with the provision of training and upskilling opportunities to ensure that any community partners that you are working with have the requisite knowledge and skill sets to actually meaningfully participate in that work, in that research process. And so, in other words, the community-based participatory action methodology requires a very significant commitment in terms of time and labor investments. But I can tell you from personal experience that the payoff in terms of the quality and the richness of the data gathered, more importantly, the payoff in terms of the benefits to community. For example, that the research outputs are directly informed by community and are directly meaningful to and can be used by community for advocacy purposes. I've learned that the front end labor that is involved in the use of these research methodologies is well worth the effort, and the payoff well exceeds any amount of labor and energy that you put in at the front end. Definitely worth it for the richness of the data that you gather and the benefits to community that this kind of research orientation can and does deliver. Couple words on data sharing, almost done. I've got 3 minutes. Oh, I can so do this. I got 3 slides left. Data sharing. A lot of conversation about, the need for researchers to be sharing their data. And I understand and agree with many of the arguments in favor of moving more toward more and better data sharing. So I'm going to sound like a hypocrite when I say this, but hear me out. I'm generally really reluctant to share data, particularly data that I myself have gathered from community members. I'm generally really reluctant to just turn over data sets to other researchers. Why? Well, it's not because I am trying to stifle additional analyses. It's not because I'm trying to hoard my data. It's not because I'm generally an asshole, though I'm sure some people might say that. But rather, it's the reason that I am reluctant to share data is due to concerns about whether and the extent to which the data will be used responsibly and ethically by that researcher. I'm also really concerned about the potential for misinterpretation of the data by researchers who may not have a deep knowledge of the specific community or lived experience with the specific community and or the issues that that community is facing. And you'll recall, as I said a moment ago, there were multiple times when my read and interpretation of the data were off the mark after I'd had a conversation with our community partners. And I was close to the community and I had gathered the data and I had done the interviews and I still didn't get it quite right. So you can see how and why just handing off data to someone who had no involvement in the collection of the data and may not have a lot by way of knowledge or experience with the community or the issues, the potential for misunderstanding or misuse of the data looms large, and I am not willing to compromise the promises and the trust that I worked hard to generate with the communities that worked alongside us in this research. I made promises to them that I am not willing to take a chance on. And so I worry about the ethical use of data. I'm very open to and have for much of my career collaborated with other researchers in the research process. It is, in my humble opinion, the best way of doing research. The research process can be lonely and very isolating, as you well know. And so finding good collaborators who you really like as humans and who you work well with can actually make the research process also a lot more fun. And I would argue the outputs are a lot better because there's more than one brain put together to sort of think through and to brainstorm about how to do what you're doing and all of that good stuff. So collaboration, yay. Data sharing, complicated in this space. And I'm also typically generally unable to share any data that I collect from research that is with national security practitioners or the institutions that they work for. And that is entirely due to the nature of the research agreements that I enter into with them that preclude the sharing of any data that I am given and or permitted to collect. And I would just remind all of you that your professional reputation as an ethical or as an unethical researcher will always precede you. And so it's my training, my thesis advisor always like quite literally beat it into me without beating it into me. Do not ever violate even the most minute aspect of any research agreement. Work hard to ensure that you hold up and you abide by everything. Because if you don't, And if your professional reputation is sullied, you will have a very, very difficult time getting any access or having anyone vouch for you. And it's also a relatively small space. Most national security actors in Canada know one another, and most national security actors in Canada talk to one another. And if you've become a problem in the space, you're typically known and your access is restricted. So ethical, being an ethical researcher and abiding by the dictates of any research agreements, and of course, all of you only and ever would be ethical researchers. But just wanted to underscore today, I felt compelled to underscore that sometimes some of the data restrictions are dumb and it can be like really dumb. And you're looking at the information that you need, but you're prohibited from collecting it. And I understand because I've been there that sometimes it's like, just write this down. I could write it in French and nobody would know. I could use code. But I don't do it and I won't do it because that's violating the research agreement. And there's too much at stake and too much that I could possibly lose if I did something stupid and sullied my professional reputation. So don't do it because it can make life more challenging. Last but not least, being a female researcher, for all the females or female identifying folks on this call, I can tell you, having done national security research for almost a decade now, as a woman in this space, there are far more benefits than there are challenges. However, that statement needs to be caveated. It needs to be surrounded by a few more caveats. My positionality, there is a white privilege thing when you're working with security actors. I feel when you're white and you're trained, as I am in criminology, there is a comfortability on the part of many security actors that there might not be. And I'm not white, so I can't speak to the experience of someone who isn't white. But based on conversations that I've had with colleagues, I do think that white privilege is a thing. I know it's a thing in general, but I also think it's a thing that extends into this space insofar as it pertains to getting access to national security actors and their institutions. At least that's been my experience. But it's difficult to sort of tease out the different aspects of my identity that might have facilitated my access and my success in this space because it's also about the fact that I'm somewhat known now, and there's lots of people that will vouch for me. It's also that I am a criminologist through and through, and have done quite a bit of work in the space. And so I think that there's a comfortability with me for a variety of reasons that may be specific to me as well. I'm also a full professor, and most of the people that I engage with in the security space, i.e., not the community space, are police and other security actors who exist within a very paramilitary hierarchical structure, and rank matters. And though my rank as a full professor is different from the rank system that they're accustomed to, I'm still at the top of my food chain, and they recognize that, and they're deferential to that, given my status and my positional power. And so I say all of that just to underscore there are more benefits than challenges, but the benefits that I have experienced may in many ways be tied to my whiteness, other aspects of sort of my positionality, my experience, the fact that I'm kind of known now. But I've also sensed in my gut, which is not very scientific, but that my being female has been of benefit in a variety of ways that I don't think I need to explain to the females and female identifying folks on this call. But sometimes when you're engaging with a typically male dominated institution or sector, sometimes being female catches people's attention in a way that operates to your benefit. It just does. Yeah, I said the first three things. And the last thing I'll just say is, what about experiences of sexism? Honestly, I would say no more than in other areas of my life. I was a bartender for years. So a lot of that stuff just kind of rolls off my back. That's how I paid for my education. I bartended at night and I went to school during the day. I also have a bit of a potty mouth, and anyone who is disrespectful to me will be told to fuck off very, very quickly. And people can sense that. I'm told I put off a bit of a vibe. And sometimes the vibe that I puts off, which I wasn't able to put off 5 or 10 years ago because I was younger and less experienced and all of that. But from where I sit now, I have the positional power, I do, to be able to not tolerate things that I might have otherwise put up with 5 or 10 years ago. But the sexism for women is a thing everywhere. But I would not say that I've experienced any more sexism working in the national security space than I have in any other place. Though that may also be a function of the intersectional aspects of my identity and my positionality as well, which I must acknowledge because it may very, very well be a thing. So final thoughts then, just to sort of sum up what I spoke about and the sorts of things that I'm hoping you'll take away. Doing research in the national security space is endlessly fascinating, exciting, dynamic, rapidly evolving. We need all hands on deck. And we also need a lot more people doing this research that don't look so much like me. There's a role for people that look like me in this space, but there's a real need for the diversification of the research ecosystem in the national security space to ensure that folks that have diverse forms of lived experience are doing this work and bringing different lenses to this work. But it's an exciting, amazing, endlessly fascinating space to work in, and you can pivot into new areas whenever you feel like it. It's like Madonna. All of you are likely too young, but when Madonna was young and doing her thing, everybody was like, oh, she's amazing. She reinvents herself all the time. She's a master at reinventing herself. You can do that as a researcher too. You get bored of body cameras, fine, I'm going to pivot and I'm going to do national security stuff once you get the access and the networks in place. So great fun, interesting, endlessly fascinating, tons of publishing opportunities, tons of opportunities to do good work that helps our national security apparatus do what it should do properly and well without all the nonsense that we are all very familiar with. The harms to Muslim and other communities that our systems and processes have long perpetrated. All hands on deck are needed to make sure that nonsense stops and our systems are doing what they ought to be in an unbiased way. Awareness and, so yeah, we can all make very real contributions to both academic policy and practitioner literatures, especially as we're all working to wrap our heads around this very rapidly evolving and changing space that we don't know more than we do know about. We need to know more about all aspects of this space so that we can start moving toward meaningfully working to prevent, intervene, and disrupt national security events before they happen. Awareness and reflexivity on research or positionality is critical to ensuring that the work that we all do is alive to and can help document, better understand, and work to address all of the many well-documented and systemic forms of racism and discrimination that we all know have long plagued national security operations. As I've said, diversification of the research workforce in every sense of the word is critical. And ECR training, early career researcher training and mentorship are also really critical to ensuring that the next generation of national security researchers are properly equipped to take the reins and to hit the ground running. I'm tired. I'll be retiring in the next 10 years or so, and it is one of my bucket list items to do everything that I can to help lift early career researchers so that when I'm ready to go fishing, they can take over and bring their skill sets and their talents to this space. And when you do, when you are in my shoes and you are able to do the research that you want to do and provide training and mentorship opportunities for early career researchers, please pay it forward when you are able and take early career researchers under your wing and give them the training and the mentorship that you're receiving from your mentors and others today. That's how we know better and do better, and how we grow the knowledge base and help to ensure that national security operations are effective, do not trample on people's human and civil rights, and actually, work to meaningfully protect national security and community safety. That's all I have. Oh, I went too long. I'm sorry. So I'll answer any questions really fast, but also we'll just point out my email address is right there. And so if anybody wants to reach out and have a sidebar conversation, given that I nattered for as long as I did, please do feel free. I'd be more than happy to jump on a call or have an email exchange or whatever. I'll shut up. Audrey, it's all over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was such a great presentation, and thank you so much for sharing your personal experience in navigating research. There's so many takeaways from from your talk. I must say that I'm very impressed by your networking skills and your dedication to cultivating a relationship, but particularly I'm impressed with your dedication to equal partnership with communities, which I think is truly important in this field as well. So we do have a few minutes for our Q&A session. Okay, let me. Well, I have a first question here. It's a bit long, so if you want to read it at the same time, you can, Sarah, but I will read it out loud for the public. So, could you talk a bit more about research agreements and academic freedom? So, there are often clauses that give security institution approval to review research for accuracy, or more generally, how you discuss the institution. So, I get why they are included, but how do you constrain them or decide whether to sign them? And this go hand in hand with discussion of setting boundaries about the data, showing what the data show.
Yeah, really good question. So it goes back to answer this question goes back to some of the things that I said already. So absolutely, whoever's posed this question is absolutely correct. When you enter into research agreements with institutions, they tend to be very, very detailed, and they tend to have a clause, and the language varies, but basically sort of gets at the same point that the institution requests and requires, in order to grant access, the opportunity to review any research outputs, to review and offer feedback on any research outputs prior to those outputs being disseminated to whomever. Before them, before the outputs go back to the funding agency or before any publications are done. Typically, I work with legal at my university to soften that language, to ensure that it's abundantly clear that while the organization has the opportunity to review and offer feedback, the researcher makes the final call about whether any feedback might ultimately be included or not. And certainly earlier in my career, these navigating these issues was a little bit more of a tense exercise, but I've learned over the years to have the conversations that I spoke to earlier. So I will, in some of the early conversations, engage with my contacts at whatever the institution is and say, here's how I work. And so if, I'll do this, we'll have, regular sort of calls where I keep you up to date on what's going on. And I want your feedback. And there will be multiple opportunities for you to provide your feedback, but at the end of the day, I may or may not incorporate it. And if that's a deal breaker for you, then we need to not even proceed to talking about drafting a research agreement, because that's how it's got to be. And earlier in my career, there was some pushback, and there were a couple of projects that never ultimately became things because we just couldn't get past that. But what I found now is I'm known and my work is known, and I've had very little pushback that I can recall off the top of my head in the last 5 years. Typically, it's understood. And there's been no issue there. So I think just standing firm in here, at all stages, and ensuring that the research agreement, that the language of it doesn't paint you into a corner in any way, and being willing to walk away if they're insistent. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about your integrity as a researcher and the integrity of the data and what you ultimately produce. I would, and it's easy for me to say as a full professor, not someone who's, playing the tenure game and hoping to get publications and whatnot. It's easy for me to say I would walk away if we couldn't get to an agreement. Whereas pre-tenure, I would have done anything and everything possible to make that research happen, right? So I recognize that I'm in a different position than some folks may be. But at the end of the day, again, it goes back to that professional reputation that you cultivate, and it is a small world, this world. And security actors that I was engaging with 10 years ago, I'm re-engaging with in ways I would never have anticipated today. And they're now in positions where they're calling the shots. So you never know who you're going to sort of circle back and have involvement with. And it's always best to not burn any bridges. But at the same time, you have to be clear on what your no-goes are. And if an organization is not willing to sort of compromise with you on that, we want to review and offer feedback, I think you need to be prepared to walk away if need be. Even though I recognize that's easier for me to say and harder for more pre-tenure folks to do. Bigger picture, it's important to sort of remember that and think through what your decisions might mean for optics and for your larger professional reputation. Um, I don't know if I addressed your question meaningfully, but that's what I think.
Do you have time for another question, Sarah?
I'm happy to answer as many as you like.
Perfect. So we have another question here asking, well, you mentioned the importance of making connections with people who are already working in the national security space. But for individuals who have just graduated and are transitioning out of academia, what advice do you have for presenting themselves and building those connections in a way that resonates with practitioners in the field?
Yeah, really good question. Go where they go. So, go to conferences and seminars and presentations. There's a growing number of opportunities available online in the post-COVID context, which makes it easier to attend, a little harder to sort of initiate conversation with individuals because you're all online. But going where they go and doing what you can to reach out and initiate conversation and rapport with individuals. I've been known to send cold call emails, and even earlier in my career, identifying an individual within an organization and then emailing them and just with an ask. Hi, I am a researcher. I do work in this area. I'm interested in learning more. And more often than not, I'm surprised that I get a response, and sometimes those folks are willing to meet. Um, Leveraging existing resources on the part of colleagues, supervisors, other academics, if you're an academic, if you're in the policy sphere, leveraging the networks of coworkers and supervisors, really, really important as well. I said earlier, it's about who you know, but equally importantly, it's who knows you. So something that I used to do early on and I still do it occasionally, is when I come across a research paper that I think, oh man, the chiefs that I know really need to know this. And it can be any issue, national security related or otherwise. I've been known to write what I call quick and dirty one pagers that summarize a complicated research paper, and send it to a listserv of police practitioners that I know. Hey, you guys, this new research just came out. It's solid research, solid methodology. The findings are statistically significant and may have import for the work that you all do. I've written an easy lay summary. Feel free to reach out if you want to talk more, if there's anything I can do. And I send this stuff out. And I send it out to maybe 100 people. Again, all of the business cards that I've collected, I send them out. And I'm still shocked at the ripple effects of that and how many people I get emails from time to time. Hey, the next time you do one of those, can you add me to your listserv? So and so told me about this. So be creative. Think about ways that you can make yourself useful to security actors. They don't have time to read the research. They don't have time to sort of, maintain knowledge currency. There are a bunch of things that academics can do to lighten the load of security actors and help them to do what they do in a more practiced and evidence-based way. So think creatively about things that you might be able to do like that, and then be bold and send out those emails. Hi, just trying to help, take it or leave it, blah, 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 blah. I do it with a little bit of humor. And the reception has been very, very positive. So again, that's just one example of a creative way that you might think about making yourself known and useful to people in the space wherever it is that you may be working.
So I'm gonna ask one last question, Sarah, for the sake of time. I see that there's a lot of other questions, very good question actually in the Q&A, but a lot of them focuses on researching right-wing extremism or security concern. And since we're gonna talk specifically about that next month, so on October 16, if you want to join us, it's gonna be a talk by Elizabeth Person, and she's gonna talk about conducting interviews with extremism. So, her talk is entitled, Is It Okay to Talk to Extremists? Navigating Gender and Avoiding Legitimization in Ethnography with the Far Right. So, I think that most of your question will be addressed there. So, for the last question I'm going to ask you, Sarah, is go as this like this. So, with the CBP methods aiming to build collaboration and trust, and violent extremism research often shaped by security agendas and surveillance, how can ECRs engage with community as real partner while navigating those constraints?
Such a good question. And it was one that we had to navigate all the time because our funding came from Public Safety Canada government, and community would be like, yo, who's funding this? And we'd be like, public safety. And they're like, yeah, you can go, you can leave, bye. And I'd be like, wait, 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 wait. And then I'd sit down and I'd say, hear me out. And I'd explain the CVPA methodology, right? And I'd say, I understand where you're coming from. Um, but this is the methodological approach that we use. And it would involve you and other community members being part of this from the beginning, having an equal voice in this research from talking about research design, identifying research questions, all the way through to disseminating findings. And I found that when community realizes that they would have a very, very meaningful role in shaping and in driving the research, that helps open the door. And then when you keep showing up and you adhere to the principles of the community-based participatory action research, and you keep showing up, and the community members see, okay, she put her money where her mouth is, and she keeps showing up and she's listening to us, and we are playing a very, very meaningful role in driving this. That's where you start to hit the sweet spot that I've seen. And it can be contentious and there can be conversations and disagreements, and there are because we're humans and that's how this goes. But I have found this methodology in particular, I've watched as community partners, as the relationships develop and people become more and more comfortable in the team, because it is a team, right? Sort of gels. And, some of the team members from some of the Somali and Tamil research, like we're all still super tight and communicate regularly 10 years later with community members and giving community talks. And so these methodologies can help in a larger context where government, which has is funding this research, and the government's agenda is very, very different from the agenda of community members in this space. But these methodologies can give you enough wiggle room to find a little bit of a sweet spot where most people are comfortable, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarah, for an amazing talk. So, as I said, the next webinar will be on October 16. So please check out the Kansas and CRX website for more information. We will be hosting Elizabeth Pearson from the University of London. So see you all in a month.
Thanks for your attention, everybody. Have a good day, night, morning.
Thank you.